My name is Evelyn Thorne, and for 42 years, I was a woman of silence. I lived in the quiet between the stacks of the Derry Public Library, a place where whispers are the only currency and the world is filtered through the smell of aging paper and floor wax. I spent my life helping others find their stories, never once realizing that my own children were busy writing the final chapter of mine. Last Tuesday, my daughter, Clara, left me her 94th voicemail in 4 days. In it, she wasn't the composed, professional woman she pretends to be. She was hysterical, her voice cracking like thin ice under the weight of a desperate greed. I caught one sentence through the static of her sobbing, "Mom, you're destroying our lives, you have to fix this." I didn't delete it. I didn't even flinch. I simply drove to my attorney's office, set my phone on his mahogany desk, and let the recording bleed into the room. Mr. Sterling, a man who has seen the ugliest parts of family probate for 30 years, listened to exactly 11 of them before he raised a hand to stop me. He removed his reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with a pity that would have stung if I weren't already numb. He said 4 words. 4 words that effectively severed the umbilical cord that had been strangled around my neck for 4 decades. I'll tell you exactly what those 4 words were. But first, you need to understand how a retired librarian from a coastal Maine town, a woman who mends her own socks and buys day-old bread, ended up with a phone full of venom and 3 adult children who suddenly realized their mother was the only thing standing between them and a total financial collapse. You see, in Derry, people think they know me. They see the rusted Volvo in the driveway of the old Thorne house on the cliffside. They see the woman who walks her dog, Silas, along the jagged rocks every morning at 6 a.m., rain or shine. They see the librarian's pension. What they didn't see was the 40 years of disciplined money. They didn't see the index cards I kept in a shoebox, tracking every cent, every dividend, every sacrifice made in the dark. My children knew I was comfortable. They had no idea I was sitting on an estate worth over $1 million. And they certainly had no idea that while they were planning how to spend it, I was planning how to disappear. I grew up in a house where $1 was a soldier. You didn't send it out unless you knew it was coming back with reinforcements. My father was a fisherman who lost his life to the Atlantic when I was 12, and my mother worked 3 jobs to keep that house on the cliff from being reclaimed by the bank. I learned early that the only thing more dangerous than the ocean is the feeling of being unprotected. When I started at the library in 1982, my salary was $14,000 a year. I never made what Julian, my oldest, would call real money. But I made money that worked. I didn't buy a new car every 5 years. I learned how to change my own oil. I didn't vacation in the Caribbean. I hiked the Appalachian Trail with a pack full of peanut butter sandwiches. Every cent I didn't spend on the vanity of the world, I funneled into a diversified portfolio that I managed with the same meticulousness I used to categorize the biography section. By the time I retired 5 years ago, that shoebox of index cards had transformed into a digital reality of 7 figures. My house, a Victorian built into the granite of the Maine coast, was paid off in full 20 years early. I stood in my kitchen on the day of the final payment, the deed in my hand, and I didn't feel like a homeowner. I felt like a survivor. I had built a fortress. But a fortress is only as strong as the people you allow inside. My children were the only ones with the keys. Julian, my architect, was the one who taught me that beauty is expensive and often hollow. I worked every Saturday for 15 years, overtime, holiday shifts, inventory nights. Just to ensure he could attend the best design school in the country without a single student loan. I remember the day he graduated. He didn't even look back at me in the crowd. He was already looking at the skyline of New York, calculating how high he could build. Then there was Cassian, my middle child. He was always chasing the next big thing, which usually meant he was running away from the last big disaster. When his tech startup imploded in his 20s, it was my rainy day fund that kept him out of bankruptcy. I told myself it was an investment in his future. I didn't realize I was just funding his inability to grow up. And Clara. My youngest. My fragile one. When she went through a bitter divorce and her ex-husband disappeared, I was the one who drove 600 miles to move her back home. I was the one who slept on her floor for 3 months, holding her hand while she cried, and paying the mortgage on a house she couldn't afford. That was my role for 40 years, the safety net. The backup plan. The one nobody actually planned to use until the ground gave way. I was the silent foundation, and like most foundations, I was walked on, ignored, and assumed to be permanent. But foundations can crack. And sometimes, when they do, the whole house comes down with them. The ghost of Arthur Thorne still haunts the hallways of this house, though not in the way you'd think. Arthur was a man of quiet strength, a carpenter who understood that the grain of wood tells you exactly how it will break. We were married for 38 years before the shadows in his lungs finally won. The 14 months between his diagnosis and his funeral were the loudest silences of my life. I handled every oncology appointment. I argued with insurance adjusters who treated human life like a math problem. I sat up with him until 3 a.m. every night because he was terrified that if he closed his eyes, he'd forget how to breathe. I did it alone. Julian was overwhelmed with a project in Dubai. Cassian was finding himself in a spiritual retreat that suspiciously had no cell service. Clara called once a week, mostly to tell me how hard it was for her to hear her father's voice so weak. She couldn't handle the pain, she said. So I handled it for her. I absorbed his agony, his fear, and his final, rattling breaths, all while they sent thinking of you flowers that died on the entryway table because I was too busy changing oxygen tanks to water them. After Arthur died, the children stayed for exactly 3 days. They went through his closet, took his antique watches and his grandfather's cufflinks, and then they vanished back to their lives. They left me in a house that felt too big, with a dog that looked for Arthur at the back door every evening, and a heart that was starting to realize it had been emptied out. For 5 years, I accepted the crumbs they threw me. A text on Mother's Day. A 10-minute call on my birthday that was mostly about their own stress. I told myself they were busy. I told myself that successful children are meant to fly away. I believed that lie until February of this year. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Maine winter morning where the sky is the color of a bruised plum. I went in for my annual physical with Dr. Vance. He's been my doctor since Julian was in diapers. He checked my blood pressure, my heart rate, and my bone density. He told me I was in infuriatingly good health for a woman of 67. But then, he stopped. He set his clipboard down, looked me in the eye, and asked the question that changed the trajectory of my life. Evelyn, do you have a formal plan for your long-term care? If you fall on those rocks, or if your memory starts to slip, who is the person who steps in? It was a routine question. A checkbox on a medical form. But it hit me like a rogue wave. When Arthur was sick, I was the plan. I was the doctor, the nurse, the accountant, and the priest. I had spent 40 years being everyone's emergency contact, but as I sat in that cold exam room in a paper gown, I realized with a terrifying clarity that I didn't have one of my own. I went home that night and sat in Arthur's old leather chair. I looked at the photos on the mantel, the graduation, the weddings, the holidays. I realized I had built a life based on a fundamental assumption, that the love I had poured out would eventually flow back. I had carried that certainty like a heavy coat, never realizing it was actually a shroud. I decided then that I wouldn't leave it to chance. I wouldn't assume. I would ask. I would give them the opportunity to be the people I raised them to be. I planned a dinner for the following Sunday. I told them it was important. I told them I needed to discuss the future of the Thorne estate. They all came. Of course they did. Mention an estate to a Thorne, and they'll find a way to clear their schedule. They arrived with smiles that didn't reach their eyes and appetites for a legacy they hadn't earned. I watched them walk through the front door, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my children. I saw a group of strangers who looked just like the people I used to love. I didn't know then that by the time dessert was served, would see something even worse. I would see exactly what was hiding in the dark, just beneath the surface of their smiles. The table was set with the same precision I'd used for decades, but the atmosphere in the dining room was different. It wasn't the warmth of a homecoming, it was the pressurized silence of a courtroom. I had spent 3 days preparing the meal, a slow-roasted herb chicken, root vegetables from the cellar, and a blackberry cobbler made from the thickets Arthur and I used to pick together. It was a menu of ghosts, a final offering from a woman who was still trying to believe her own heart was wrong. Julian sat to my right, his expensive watch catching the light of the chandelier every time he reached for his wine. Cassian was opposite him, his fingers twitching rhythmically against the tablecloth, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy, though now it looked like he was just counting down the minutes until he could leave. Clara sat at the far end, her eyes darting between her brothers, looking for a cue. For an hour, we performed the ritual of the successful family. We talked about Julian's new firm, Cassian's consulting work, and the private school Clara wanted for her daughter. They spoke over me, around me, and through me, treating my presence as a quaint backdrop to their ambition. Then, I cleared my throat. I didn't raise my voice, but the library had taught me how to command a room with a single exhaled breath. I told them about my appointment with Dr. Vance. I told them about the routine question. I looked at each of them, the faces I had wiped clean of tears, the eyes I had looked into while whispering that everything would be okay, and I asked it. When the time comes that I can no longer manage this house, or myself, which of you will be the one to open your door for me? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. It was the sound of 3 doors slamming in unison. Julian was the first to speak. He didn't look at me, he looked at his wine. Mom, you have to be realistic. My life is in the city. My schedule is international. I'm barely in the country 3 months a year. Bringing you into that, it wouldn't be fair to you. Cassian followed, his voice oily with a fake sort of regret. I'm in a transitional phase, Mom. My living situation is fluid. I can barely take care of my own logistics right now. I'd be the worst choice for your peace of mind. Then came Clara. She reached out and patted my hand, a gesture that felt like being touched by a mannequin. Mom, you know I've had such a hard year. My mental health is so fragile, and with the baby. I just don't think I have the emotional capacity for that kind of responsibility. It's a lot to ask of someone. In less than 60 seconds, 40 years of maternal labor were appraised and deemed a liability. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the coordination of it. They didn't even argue with each other. They didn't suggest a rotation. They didn't offer to find a solution together. They had arrived with their shields already locked. I sat there, the matriarch of a dynasty of one, and I realized that my children didn't see a mother. They saw a problem that needed to be managed, a line item on a balance sheet that they were determined to outsource. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, cleared the plates, and told them I had a headache. They left within 20 minutes, their relief so palpable it practically vibrated the floorboards. I stood at the window and watched their taillights disappear down the cliffside road, feeling the foundation of my life finally give way. I was alone in the fortress I had built for them, and for the first time, I realized the walls weren't there to keep them safe, they were there to keep me trapped. 2 days later, Clara returned. She said she'd forgotten her tablet on the side table, but I knew her better than that. She wanted to gauge my temperature, to see if the talk had made me bitter or, more importantly, if it had made me rethink the will. She stayed for 10 minutes, rambling about a playdate and the cost of tuition, her eyes constantly scanning my face for a sign of weakness. When her phone buzzed with a notification from her ex-husband, she jumped, apologized, and practically ran out the door, leaving her tablet sitting right where she claimed she'd left it. I wasn't going to look. I have spent my life respecting the privacy of the written word. But as I walked past the kitchen island to pour a cup of tea, the screen lit up. It was a notification from a group chat titled Heirs Only. My heart didn't race, it slowed down, a cold, heavy thud in my chest. I picked it up. My thumb hovered over the glass. I told myself to put it down, but the silence of the house whispered a different command: know the truth. I opened the chat. I scrolled up to the morning of the Sunday dinner. Julian wrote, "She's going to ask. I can feel it. Vance probably spooked her at the checkup. Remember the script, no volunteering." If one of us budges, we all get stuck. Cassian replied, got it. I'll play the unstable card. Works every time. Clara added, I feel bad, but Julian's right. If she moves in with me, the house sits empty. We need to get it on the market as soon as she's in a facility. That coastal acreage is at an all-time high. Julian again, exactly. The house is the prize. If we play this right, we can have it listed by next spring. I've already talked to a developer who wants to turn the Thorne lot into 3 luxury condos. We're looking at a 7-figure split, minimum. Clara asked, what if she pushes back? Julian answered, she won't. She's a librarian, Clara. She avoids conflict like the plague. She'll do what she's told. She always has. I read those messages until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. They weren't waiting for me to get old, they were treating me like a squatter in my own home. My life's work, the sacrifices I'd made, the overtime shifts, the mended socks, the quiet endurance of Arthur's death, it was all just a hurdle between them and a real estate commission. They were pricing the coffin before I was even in the ground. I set the tablet down face first on the counter. I didn't feel the anger I expected. I felt a strange, terrifying clarity. It was the feeling a soldier gets when the fog of war finally lifts and they realize the enemy isn't across the field. They're in the tent. I walked out to the porch and sat in the cold Maine air, watching the Atlantic churn against the rocks. The ocean doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care about your loyalty. It only cares about the strength of your resolve. I thought about Julian's luxury condos. I thought about Cassian's debt relief. I thought about Clara's fragility. And then, I thought about the index cards in my shoebox. I had spent 40 years being the silent foundation. But a foundation that is no longer valued doesn't have to hold the house up anymore. It can simply shift. The next morning, I didn't go to the library. I didn't walk Silas. I sat at my desk and opened a folder I hadn't touched since Arthur's funeral. The tab read, Last Will and Testament. I picked up the phone, but I didn't call my children. I called Mr. Sterling. Evelyn, he said, sounding surprised. Everything all right? I need an appointment, Marcus. Immediately. And I need you to recommend a specialist. A specialist for what? A psychiatric evaluator, I said, my voice as steady as the granite beneath my house. I want a full, documented mental competency exam. I want it dated, notarized, and filed before I sign a single page of what we're about to do next. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sterling had known me for decades, but he'd never heard this version of Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn, that's a very aggressive move. Are you sure? I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Marcus. My children think I'm a librarian who avoids conflict. I think it's time they learned that librarians are the keepers of the truth. And the truth is about to become very expensive for them. I spent the rest of the week in a blur of calculated motion. I met with the psychiatrist, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Eris, who spent 3 hours testing my memory, my logic, and my resolve. She asked me why I wanted the evaluation. I told her the truth, because the people I love are going to try to prove I'm crazy. I want to make sure they fail. By Friday, I had the documents. I had the evaluation. And I had a new plan. I went back to Sterling's office. I didn't sit in the guest chair, I sat in the client chair. I told him what I wanted. I wanted every cent, every share, and the deed to the Thorne house moved into an irrevocable trust. I wanted the beneficiary changed from my children to the Derry Children's Respiratory Center, the place that had kept my grandson, Leo, alive when his own parents were too overwhelmed to stay in the hospital room. You're cutting them out completely? Sterling asked, his pen hovering over the legal pad. Not just cutting them out, Marcus. I'm liquidating the legacy they think they've already won. But before I file this, I'm going to disappear. I've spent 40 years in this library. I think it's time I saw the world they've been enjoying on my dime. I booked a flight that night. Not to New York, and not to Dubai. I booked a one-way ticket to Amalfi. I didn't tell Clara. I didn't tell Julian. I left a note on the kitchen island, right next to the tablet Clara had forgotten. It was a simple note, written in my best library cursive. Dear children, I've decided to take your advice. I'm looking into options for my future. I'll be gone for a while. Don't worry about the house, it's been taken care of. I pulled the door shut behind me, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. As I drove toward the airport, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't realized I was carrying. I was 67 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's backup plan. But as I sat in the boarding lounge, watching the rain streak across the window, my phone began to vibrate. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a voicemail. It was a notification from the security system I'd installed at the house years ago. Someone had just entered the front door using the emergency key. And based on the heat map moving through my living room, they weren't there to check on the plants. They were searching for the shoebox. I watched the flickering blue light of the security app on my phone as I sat in the departure lounge. 3 distinct heat signatures moved through the Thorne house. They weren't mourning my absence. They were a demolition crew in designer clothes. I saw them converge in the study, likely tearing through Arthur's desk, hunting for the deed, the account numbers, the proof of the comfortable life they intended to liquidate. I closed the app and turned off my phone. Let them search. The shoebox was gone, tucked safely into a safe deposit box at a bank they didn't even know I used. The silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt in years. I landed in Italy with nothing but a suitcase and a resolve that felt as sharp as a sea urchin. For the first few days in Amalfi, I simply sat. I sat on a balcony that overlooked a sea so blue it looked painted, eating bread that hadn't been bought with a coupon and drinking wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget in Derry. I was a ghost in paradise, a retired librarian from Maine who had finally stopped shushing her own desires. But the peace was a thin veil. Every time I saw a mother walking with her grown children on the cobblestone streets, my heart would tighten. I'd see a son pull out a chair for his elderly mother, or a daughter lean in to catch a whispered joke, and the betrayal would roar back, cold and salty like a nor'easter. It was during my second week, while sitting in a small cafe in Positano, that I truly understood the magnitude of what I had done, and what I still had to do. I pulled out a fresh notebook I'd bought at a local stationery shop. I didn't write about the scenery. I began to draft the memorandum of intent that Mr. Sterling had requested. I wrote about the nights I spent in the hospital with Leo, my grandson. I wrote about the hum of the ventilator, the way the plastic tubing looked against his tiny, pale chest, and the way Julian and Clara had stood in the hallway, arguing about who had to stay for the night shift before both eventually leaving me there alone. I realized then that the money wasn't just savings. It was a weapon of survival. It had saved Leo because strangers had donated to that hospital years before he was ever born. By shifting my estate to the respiratory center, I wasn't just punishing my children, I was joining a cycle of grace they were too blind to see. I spent my afternoons in Italy and my evenings in the Scottish Highlands, moving like a shadow through the world. I hiked the Isle of Skye, the wind whipping my hair, my lungs burning with air that didn't smell like old books or betrayal. I felt younger, lighter, but with every stamp in my passport, the legal architecture back in Maine was hardening. The trust was being funded. The deed was being transferred. The trap was being set. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't listen to the voicemails that I knew were piling up like driftwood. I lived in the quiet. I watched sunsets over 3 different oceans, and for the first time in my 67 years, I didn't feel like a safety net. I felt like the ocean itself, vast, deep, and utterly indifferent to the ships trying to sail on my surface. I was no longer Evelyn the librarian, the woman who mended socks. I was Evelyn Thorne, the woman who was about to burn the bridge while she was still standing on it. The reconstruction of a life requires more than just travel, it requires a surgical removal of hope. While I was in Scotland, staying in a small stone cottage that overlooked a misty loch, I received an encrypted email from Mr. Sterling. The transfer of the Thorne house into the irrevocable trust was complete. In the eyes of the law, I no longer owned the house on the cliff. The Derry Children's Respiratory Center did. I was merely a lifetime tenant. This was the bulletproofing Sterling had promised. If my children tried to force me into a home to sell the property, they would find themselves sued by a multi-million-dollar medical foundation with a legal team 10 times the size of Julian's ego. I sat by the peat fire and read the psychiatric report Dr. Eris had filed. It was a masterpiece of clinical clarity. Subject demonstrates high cognitive function, exceptional long-term memory, and a clear, rational motivation for her estate planning based on documented family dynamics. It was my shield. It was the document that would turn their inevitable claims of dementia into a laughingstock in probate court. I felt a grim satisfaction, the kind a librarian feels when a long-lost, overdue book is finally returned to its proper shelf. Everything was in its place. But I needed one more piece of insurance. I called the director of the respiratory center from a burner phone. Her name was Dr. Holloway. We spoke for an hour. I told her about Leo. I told her about the Thorne Fund. I told her that I wanted the money to be used specifically for families who, like me, found themselves sitting in those hospital chairs alone at 3 a.m. because their safety nets had failed them. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Mrs. Thorne, she said, her voice thick with emotion, you are changing the future for hundreds of children. No, doctor, I replied, looking out at the dark Scottish water. I'm just paying a debt I've owed since the day my grandson started breathing on his own. That call was the final nail. The moral weight of the gift now balanced the legal weight of the trust. I wasn't a bitter old woman throwing away an inheritance, I was a philanthropist securing a legacy. The children would call it a heist. The world would call it a miracle. I spent my final week abroad in London, walking through the British Library. I stood amongst the great works of history, the stories of kings who were betrayed by their sons and queens who held their ground against the tide. I realized I was just another entry in a very old catalogue. The theme of the parent as a resource to be harvested is as old as the written word. But I was the librarian. I knew how the stories were supposed to end. I knew that the protagonist only wins when they stop playing the role the villain assigned them. I packed my bags, not with souvenirs, but with the quiet, cold power of a woman who has nothing left to lose because she has already given it all away to something that matters. I touched down in Portland, Maine, on a Tuesday. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and the coming autumn. I didn't call a car. I took the bus back to Derry. I wanted to feel the hum of the road, the slow return to the life I had left behind. When I walked up the gravel driveway of the house on the cliff, I saw the signs of their intrusion immediately. A flower pot had been moved. The curtains in the study were drawn tight. The house felt violated, like a book with pages ripped out of the center. I let myself in. The air inside was stale. I walked straight to the kitchen island and saw the note I had left. It was gone. In its place was a pile of mail and a stack of business cards from local realtors. Julian hadn't even waited for the body to be cold, he had been interviewing people to sell the prize. I picked up one of the cards, a high-end firm from Portland, and ripped it into 4 perfect pieces. I dropped them into the trash can. I went to the study and sat in Arthur's chair. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the house breathe. I knew what would happen next. Word would get out that I was back. The Heirs Only chat would be lighting up with a mixture of relief and renewed calculation. They would think I was back to be managed. They would think the trip had been a final fling before I settled into the quiet life they had designed for me. I pulled my phone from my purse and turned it on for the first time in months. The vibration was constant, a frantic stutter in my palm. Missed calls, texts, alerts. But I ignored them all. I opened the security app one last time. I saw that a new alert had been triggered just 30 minutes ago. A car was turning onto the cliff road. Not one car. 3. They were coming for the confrontation they thought they were prepared for. I stood up, smoothed the cashmere sweater I'd bought in Lisbon, and walked to the front door. I didn't lock it. I opened it wide, letting the cold Atlantic wind howl into the entryway, and waited on the porch as the headlights cut through the dark. They thought they were coming to a funeral, but they were about to realize I was the only one in the room who was truly alive. I watched the lead car, Julian's black SUV, pull to a stop, and as he stepped out, his face illuminated by the porch light, I saw the exact moment he realized I wasn't wearing my old librarian's cardigan. I was wearing the armor of a woman who had already signed their names out of history. Julian was the first to reach the porch, his stride confident, the alpha of a pack that had already divided the spoils. He stopped 5 feet away, his eyes scanning me from my Italian boots to my silver hair, which I'd stopped pinning back into a tight bun. He looked for the frailty he discussed in the group chat, but all he found was the cold, polished surface of a woman who had spent 4 months breathing the air of a world that didn't know his name. Cassian and Clara trailed behind him, their faces a frantic mix of feigned relief and poorly hidden irritation. "Mom," Julian started, his voice a perfect modulation of filial concern. "You nearly gave us a heart attack. You can't just vanish for months. We had no idea where you were. We were about to call the authorities." "The authorities for what, Julian?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. "For a woman of sound mind taking a vacation? Or for a woman who wasn't where you needed her to be so you could sign her life away?" The directness hit him like a physical blow. He glanced at Cassian, then back at me, his smile slipping just a fraction. "Let's go inside, Mom. It's freezing out here. We've been worried. We've been talking. We've made some arrangements to make things easier for you." I didn't move. I stood in the doorway of the Thorne house, a sentinel at the gates of a kingdom they no longer owned. "I'm sure you have." I saw the real estate cards on the kitchen island. I saw the heat maps on my security app. "You didn't come here tonight to welcome me home. You came here to inventory the furniture." Clara pushed forward then, her eyes welling with the strategic tears she'd practiced for 30 years. "Mom, that's not fair. We're your children. We were just trying to get ahead of the logistics. You're 67, and after Dad, we just want you to be safe. In a place where you're cared for." "Safe," I repeated the word, letting it hang in the salt air. "You mean a place where I'm out of the way? A place with a locked door and a monthly bill that would eventually be paid for by the sale of this granite?" "I've seen the Heirs Only chat, Clara. I've read the script. Don't volunteer. Let her figure it out. Sell the house and split it." It was a very efficient plan. Almost poetic, in its cruelty. The silence that followed was different from the one at the dinner table. This was the silence of a trapped animal realizing the cage door isn't just locked, it's been electrified. Cassian shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the SUV as if looking for an exit. Julian, however, doubled down. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating hum. "Mom, you're clearly emotional. The trip, it's been too much. You're confused. We have power of attorney documents ready. We're going to help you make the right choice before you do something you regret." "I don't regret a single thing, Julian," I said, stepping back and finally allowing them to enter the foyer. "But before we discuss your arrangements, I think you should know that you aren't the only ones who have been busy with paperwork. I've spent my time abroad doing more than just looking at glaciers and cobblestones. I've been busy securing the one thing you were so eager to take." I walked into the study, the 3 of them following like shadows. I sat in Arthur's chair and gestured to the 3 chairs opposite me, the ones we'd used for decades of family meetings that were always about them. I reached into my bag and pulled out the blue folder from Mr. Sterling's office. I didn't open it yet. I just set it on the desk, the weight of it sounding like a gavel. They stared at it with the hunger of vultures, unaware that the carcass they were eyeing had already stood up and walked away. The room felt smaller with the 3 of them in it, their entitlement thick enough to choke the air. Julian was already reaching for the folder, his fingers twitching with the urge to claim it, but I placed my hand firmly on top. "Not yet, Julian. First, We need to discuss the gift. Or rather, the lack of one. I watched them exchange glances. That coordinated, silent language they developed to manage me. Julian took a breath, smoothing his tie. Mom, we're not here to argue about money. This is about your care. We've looked into the Gables. It's top tier. They have a garden that looks just like yours. You'd be happy there, and we wouldn't have to worry about you being alone on this cliff. The Gables is a warehouse for the wealthy and the forgotten, I said. And the only reason you want me there is because it's the only place that would accept the bridge loan you're planning to take out against this house. But there's a problem with your math. You're calculating based on an asset that no longer exists in your column. Julian laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound. Mom, the house is in your name. It's part of the estate. Unless you sold it while you were eating pasta in Italy, it's still right here. It is right here, I replied. But it isn't mine. Not anymore. 2 weeks ago, the deed to the Thorne house was transferred into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary isn't you, Julian. Or you, Cassian. Or you, Clara. Cassian's face went pale, his eyes widening. What are you talking about? Who did you give it to? The Dairy Children's Respiratory Center, I said, the words tasting like victory. The entire estate. The house, the savings, the investments. All of it. It's been pledged as a legacy gift. I've retained a life estate, which means I'll live here until my final breath. And when that day comes, the keys don't go to you. They go to the hospital that saved Leo's life. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You gave away Leo's inheritance? How could you? He's your grandson. Leo was saved by the charity of strangers, Clara. Not by the greed of his parents, I said, my voice rising for the first time. And as for his inheritance, he'll have the most valuable thing I can give him, the knowledge that his life was worth more than a luxury condo. I've already had a psychiatric evaluation, Julian. Dr. Eris. It's in the folder. I'm fully oriented, cognitively sharp, and my intentions are documented in a memorandum that explains exactly why I've made this choice. It mentions the group chat. It mentions the rehearsed refusals at the dinner table. It turns your scripts into evidence of your unfitness to inherit. Julian stood up, his face contorted in a mask of rage I'd only seen glimpses of before. This won't hold. You were under undue influence. That neighbor, Ruth? Or that lawyer, Sterling? We'll contest this. We'll prove you weren't in your right mind. You can't just erase 40 years of family history because of a few text messages. It wasn't just the messages, Julian. It was the 40 years of silence that preceded them, I said, standing up to meet him. You can try to contest it. I've already prepared for that. Mr. Sterling has been instructed to meet any legal challenge with the full weight of the Respiratory Center's legal team. Do you have the stomach for that, Julian? To spend your remaining savings fighting a children's hospital in open court? To have those text messages read into the public record? To have the city of Derry know exactly what kind of architect you really are? He stopped, his chest heaving, the reality of the bulletproof will finally sinking in. He looked at his siblings, but the pack was breaking. Cassian looked like he wanted to vomit. Clara was sobbing into her hands, but they weren't the tears of a daughter, they were the tears of a woman who just realized her safety net had been cut into confetti. You're a monster, Clara whispered through her fingers. No, Clara, I said, walking toward the door of the study. I'm a woman who finally learned how to read the fine print. I spent my life being the person you needed me to be. Now, I'm the person I need to be. The house is closed to you tonight. And tomorrow. And every day after. I walked them to the front door. They moved like sleepwalkers, their world having shifted on its axis in less than 20 minutes. Julian turned at the threshold, his eyes cold and promising a war he couldn't win. This isn't over, Mom. You're going to die alone in this house. Is that what you want? To have no one but a dog in a memory? I'd rather die alone with my integrity than live with people who were only waiting for me to be a corpse, I said. I closed the door and locked it. I leaned my back against the wood, listening to the sound of their footsteps on the gravel, then the roar of the engines as they sped away from the cliff. Over. The fortress was mine again. I walked back into the study and sat down, expecting to feel a surge of triumph. But instead, I felt a hollow, aching exhaustion. I looked at the folder on the desk. I had one, but the cost was the finality of the bridge I'd burned. I reached for my phone to call Ruth, but it began to vibrate again. This time, it wasn't a text from my children. It was a restricted number. I answered it, my voice weary. Hello? Evelyn Thorne? A voice I didn't recognize, sharp, professional, and urgent. Yes. Who is this? This is Detective Miller with the Maine State Police. I'm calling regarding an incident on the Cliff Road involving a black SUV. We need you to come down to the station immediately. There's something we found at the scene that doesn't make sense, and your name was on it. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the empty foyer, the lock I'd just turned, and the blue folder on the desk. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, distant pulse of sirens growing louder in the dark. The drive to the station felt like a descent into a dream where the physics of the world no longer applied. The blue and red lights reflected off the pine trees, rhythmic and cold, a strobe light for the wreckage of a life I had spent 40 years trying to protect. Detective Miller met me at the door. He didn't look like a man about to deliver good news. He looked like a man who had seen the inside of a soul and found it wanting. He sat me down in a room that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. He didn't lead with the accident. He led with a heavy, transparent evidence bag. Inside was a manila envelope, singed at the edges but miraculously intact. We found this in the passenger footwell of the SUV, Miller said, his voice a low gravel. Your son, Julian, was driving. He's in surgery. The other two, they're being treated for shock. But this is what I need you to explain, Mrs. Thorne. He slid the bag across the table. Inside the manila envelope was a second, smaller envelope. It was addressed to a private investigative firm in Portland. I pulled out the contents. It wasn't a legal document. It was a dossier. Julian hadn't just been planning to sell my house, he had been investigating me. He had photos of me in Italy. He had receipts from my hotel in Scotland. But the final page, the one that made the blood in my veins turn to slush, was a forged medical report. It was a fake diagnosis of early-onset vascular dementia, signed by a doctor whose name I didn't recognize, dated 3 weeks before my actual evaluation with Dr. Harris. He wasn't just planning to contest the will. He was planning to have me committed. The intervener had prepared a cage. The crash happened because Julian was speeding, Miller continued, leaning in. But witnesses say he was arguing with the passengers so loudly they could hear it over the engines. It seems your daughter, Clara, tried to grab the envelope. She wanted to burn it. She didn't want to go that far. Julian wouldn't let go. I looked at the forged report. The ink was dark, the lies absolute. He would have erased me. He would have turned my memories into symptoms and my autonomy into a tragedy. I felt a cold, crystalline anger rise up, a fire that burned away the last lingering thread of maternal grief. I looked at Miller and realized that the 4 words Mr. Sterling had said to me in that office weren't just a legal opinion. They were a prophecy. They have no claim. Not on my money. Not on my house. And most importantly, not on my reality. I handed the dossier back to the detective. This isn't my medical history, detective. This is a confession. The fallout didn't come with a bang. It came with the slow, agonizing sound of a structure collapsing under its own hollow weight. Julian survived the surgery, but the architect of luxury condos would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, his legs shattered by the engine block of the SUV he had used as a weapon of speed. He didn't call me. He couldn't. I had filed a restraining order based on the dossier, a legal wall that was even thicker than the trust. Cassian vanished into the debt he had tried to outrun. Without the lifeboat of the Thorne estate, his creditors descended like locusts. I heard through the grapevine that he was working at a warehouse in Nevada, living in a trailer, finally forced to face the fluidity of a life without a safety net. But it was Clara who broke the silence. 2 weeks after the crash, she appeared on my porch. She didn't have a tablet. She didn't have tears. She just had a letter. It was a formal apology, written with a shaky hand, acknowledging the group chat, the rehearsals, and the dossiers. She didn't ask for money. She asked for a chance to bring Leo over for a Saturday afternoon. I sat with her on the porch, the same porch where I had watched her brothers walk away. I didn't invite her in. Not yet. I looked at my daughter and I saw the ghost of the girl I had raised, the one who wanted to be a nurse before she learned how to be an heir. "I'm not changing the will, Clara," I said, the wind catching my words. "The Thorne Fund is final. The house is a hospital's future. If you want to be in my life, you have to accept that you are visiting a woman, not an asset." She cried then, and for the first time, the tears didn't feel like a performance. They felt like the salt of a wound finally being cleaned. We sat there for an hour, watching the Atlantic. I didn't promise her forgiveness. Forgiveness is a mountain you have to climb, one step at a time, and I was still at the base. But I told her she could bring Leo on Saturday. I told her I would show him the magnolia tree. As the sun began to set over the Maine coast, painting the granite in shades of bruised gold, I realized that I had finally achieved the comfortable life I had always promised myself. But comfort wasn't about the 7 figures in the bank or the cashmere on my back. It was about the silence of a house that no longer held a secret. It was about the peace of a woman who had stopped being a resource and started being a person. I walked into the study and sat at Arthur's desk. I picked up the pen and opened my journal. I didn't write about the lawyers or the dossier. I wrote about the trip to Iceland I had just booked with my friend, Ruth. I wrote about the stars over the loch in Scotland. And then, I wrote the final line of the Thorne saga. The foundation has shifted, and the house still stands. But this time, I'm the one holding the keys. I am Evelyn Thorne. I am 67 years old. I was a librarian for 40 years, and in the end, I learned that the best stories aren't the ones you read in books. They are the ones you have the courage to write for yourself, even when the ink is made of tears and the paper is as cold as a nor'easter. My children thought they were the main characters. They thought I was just the setting. But they forgot one thing about librarians: we are the ones who decide which books stay on the shelf and which ones are removed from the collection. I have finished my final edit. And for the first time in my life, the story is exactly the way it was meant to be. If you're listening to this, and you feel like the floor is being pulled out from under you by the people you love, remember this: you are not a safety net. You are the sky. And the sky doesn't fall just because the birds decide to fly away. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of my journey. And remember, the most powerful words you will ever say are the ones that prove you belong to yourself. Good night, from the house on the cliff.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.